Good evening and welcome. Tonight we step back further than Rome, further than marble and empire, into a world of sun-baked brick and sacred rivers. A world shaped not by iron legions, but by gods who walked beside men, by cities rising from clay, by fear of death and the first written words ever pressed into stone. In this story we will explore Gilgamesh, the first king who searched for immortality, and uncover how one ruler's desperate struggle against loss and mortality became the oldest surviving epic in human history, echoing across 4,000 years from ancient Mesopotamia to the stories we still tell today. This is not just a tale of monsters and divine punishment. It is a story of friendship that changes a tyrant, of grief that awakens a king, of a man who traveled beyond the edge of the world, searching not for conquest, but for a way to escape death itself. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, settle in, take a slow breath, and let's walk the walls of Uruk. Long before Rome raised its marble columns, before Alexander dreamed of the edge of the world, before even the oldest Hebrew stories were whispered beneath desert stars, there stood a city of sun-baked brick and towering walls on the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, a city called Uruk, and within it ruled a king who was said to be two-thirds divine and one-third mortal, a ruler born not merely of flesh but of cosmic intention. A man whose strength surpassed all others and whose restlessness disturbed even the gods, Gilgamesh. His name was spoken with awe and fatigue in equal measure. He was magnificent from the beginning, forged of contradictions that made him both radiant and unbearable, blessed with a body of extraordinary power and a mind sharpened by divine ancestry, yet burdened with a spirit that could not tolerate limitation, because to be two-thirds God in a world of ordinary men is to feel perpetually misaligned with your surroundings, to sense that no equal walks beside you, and to experience not companionship but hierarchy in every human encounter. Uruk flourished under his rule, its walls immense and nearly impregnable, its temples dedicated to Anu and Ishtar rising toward the sky in geometric defiance of mortality, its markets humming with trade and ritual, its people industrious and disciplined, yet beneath the prosperity lay exhaustion, because Gilgamesh did not merely govern, he consumed, and his energy, unchecked and insatiable, demanded constant expression. He wrestled the strongest men of the city not for necessity, but for affirmation, testing his superiority in contests that left others bruised and humiliated. He claimed brides before their wedding nights because custom did not restrain him and power invited indulgence. He drove laborers harder than required because stillness irritated him, and in every action there pulsed the same underlying refusal to accept equality. As though the very idea of standing level with another human being felt like diminishment of his divine fraction. The people of Uruk, though proud of their city's grandeur, began to murmur in private courtyards and temple shadows, not daring open rebellion but quietly petitioning the heavens for relief. For while they admired his strength, they suffered under its weight, and in their collective weariness they turned their prayers upward, asking the gods to balance what felt unbalanced, to temper what felt excessive, to send something or someone who could stand before their king without bowing. It is important to understand that Gilgamesh did not perceive himself as cruel, because tyrants rarely wake believing they are tyrants. Rather, he believed himself expansive, necessary, destined to push Uruk toward greatness through force of will, convinced that his vitality justified its imposition, that his difference from ordinary men required extraordinary expression, and in this belief he found both confidence and blindness. For what is restraint to one who has never been truly challenged? What is humility to one who has never been defeated? His lineage only reinforced the illusion, for his mother, the goddess Ninsun, was wise and luminous, and his father, the priest-king Lugalbanda, carried sacred authority, and from this union emerged a being who could lift stones no other man could move and who could endure battles that would break lesser bodies. And when such a man surveys his city, sees its towers, hears its praise, and feels no rival's presence, he begins to interpret dominance as destiny. Yet destiny in the ancient world is rarely unilateral. The gods listened to the people of Uruk not because they rejected Gilgamesh outright, but because imbalance disrupts cosmic order, and what grows too powerful without counterweight threatens harmony itself. And so in the wilderness beyond cultivated fields, in the spaces where civilization had not yet imposed geometry upon nature, they shaped an answer. From clay and divine breath they formed Enkidu. But Enkidu's story belongs to the next chapter. For now, what matters is the state of the king before the interruption, before the mirror was created for him, before the first crack appeared in his seamless self-perception. Gilgamesh walked the walls of Uruk often, gazing outward across the plains where irrigation channels glistened beneath the sun and farmers bent in patient labor. And perhaps in those solitary moments he felt something like restlessness that even conquest could not quiet, because physical strength satisfies only briefly when the deeper hunger is existential, when what one seeks is not merely victory but validation of uniqueness, confirmation that one's existence is not just larger, but singular. He commissioned monuments, reinforced gates, and ensured that Uruk's fortifications would be remembered long after his bones returned to dust. And here we glimpse an early flicker of the theme that will define him, an anxiety not yet conscious but already active, the sense that walls might outlast flesh, that stone might endure where blood cannot, that perhaps greatness is measured not by how long one lives, but by what remains when life ends. But such thoughts, if they visited him, were fleeting, because youth and divine proportion dull the awareness of mortality. And at this stage Gilgamesh moved through the world as though permanence were implicit, as though the gods' favor implied exemption from ordinary human fate, and it is precisely this assumption that makes the later transformation so profound. For now he was unmatched in battle, unmatched in authority, unmatched in arrogance, and the absence of equal is both intoxicating and isolating. Isolation breeds distortion. Without resistance, identity inflates. Without correction, impulse hardens into habit. Gilgamesh's reign, therefore, was not chaos but imbalance, a city thriving materially under a king who had never been forced to see himself reflected in another's strength, a ruler whose vitality demanded friction yet encountered none. A half-divine being suspended between worlds, too powerful to blend, too human to transcend entirely, and unknowingly poised on the edge of the first relationship that would fracture and reform him. The people continued their prayers. The gods continued their observation, and somewhere beyond Uruk's walls, in untamed wilderness where gazelles ran unafraid, and animals gathered around a wild-haired man who knew no city and no hierarchy, the counterweight to the king was awakening. But in Uruk, on the eve of that collision, Gilgamesh remained exactly what he had always been: a force without mirror, a sovereign without equal, a man who believed that to be unmatched was to be complete. He did not yet understand that completion requires reflection. He did not yet understand that strength untested by loss remains immature. He did not yet understand that walls, no matter how high, cannot keep death outside forever. For now he walked beneath the Mesopotamian sun with confidence uncracked, his name echoing against brick and stone, his presence bending the rhythm of the city around him, unaware that the gods had already decided that no king, not even one 2/3 divine, should stand alone without challenge. And so the first great human story begins not with war, nor with prophecy, nor with tragedy, but with imbalance, with a king who would not be equal, and a universe preparing to teach him why he must be. The universe rarely corrects imbalance with subtlety, and when the people of Uruk lifted their tired voices toward the heavens asking not for the destruction of their king, but for relief from his excess, the gods did not send plague or famine or foreign armies to humble him, because those would have broken the city along with the ruler. Instead, they chose something more precise, more intimate, and infinitely more transformative. They fashioned an equal. The wild places beyond Uruk's cultivated order, where reeds bent in marsh winds and gazelles moved like living currents across open plains, where no walls divided space and no laws constrained instinct, the goddess Araru shaped a figure from clay, pressing earth into muscle and breath into lungs, forming a being powerful as the king yet untouched by civilization's imprint. A man who would grow not among brick and ceremony, but among animals and silence, and into that clay she breathed life. He was called Enkidu. His body was covered in hair like a beast's pelt, his strength raw and unrefined, his eyes unclouded by hierarchy, his mind untrained in politics or pride, and in his early days he knew nothing of cities, nothing of kings, nothing of gods beyond the instinctive harmony of existence. He ran with gazelles, drank from watering holes beside antelope, tore grass from the earth, and freed animals from hunters' traps without understanding that he disrupted human economy, because to him there was no distinction between human and beast, only life moving in rhythm with land. The hunters were the first to feel the disruption, because traps once reliable were sprung open by unseen hands, game once plentiful vanished from snares, and footprints in the mud revealed not a creature of known kind but something disturbingly human in shape yet untamed in pattern, and fear mixed with confusion as word traveled back toward Uruk that a wild man roamed the wilderness, stronger than ordinary men and resistant to capture. When news reached Gilgamesh, he did not hear threat, he heard possibility. For a king weary of unmatched dominance, the rumor of a powerful unknown stirred curiosity beneath irritation, and rather than dispatch soldiers to kill the anomaly, he chose a different tactic, one revealing both his strategic mind and the values of his civilization. He sent not warriors but a woman, Shamhat, a temple priestess of Ishtar, versed in sacred rites and the arts of intimacy, trained not merely in seduction but in the subtle transformation of the human psyche through touch, conversation, and ritual. Because in Mesopotamian thought, sexuality was not separate from spirituality, and to initiate a being into physical intimacy was also to initiate them into culture, into language, into awareness of separation from nature. Shamhat found Enkidu near a watering place, and for days she remained, offering presence without force, allowing curiosity to bridge distance, until finally he approached, drawn not by command but by wonder, and what unfolded between them was not a single act but a prolonged crossing of thresholds, a merging of bodies that awakened in Enkidu not merely pleasure but consciousness of difference, of self distinct from animal herd, of desire layered with thought. For 6 days and 7 nights they lay together, and when at last he rose and turned toward the gazelles, expecting to resume the effortless rhythm of his former life, he discovered that something irrevocable had shifted. The animals fled from him. The herd no longer accepted him as equal. His legs felt heavier, his instincts interrupted by reflection, his body the same, yet his awareness altered, and in that moment he experienced the first fracture that defines human existence, the loss of seamless unity with nature in exchange for self-knowledge. Shamhat spoke to him then of Uruk, of its towering walls and vibrant markets, of its king unmatched in strength, of Gilgamesh whose vitality rivaled the gods, and Enkidu listened not as subject but as emerging consciousness, sensing in the description of this ruler something like a magnet drawing him toward confrontation. He did not yet understand destiny. He only felt momentum. Together they journeyed toward Uruk, and as they walked, Shamhat taught him language more refined than growls, clothed him in garments that marked participation in society, fed him bread and beer, and each ritual of civilization layered upon him like armor of culture, distancing him further from the wilderness while sharpening his awareness of the coming encounter. By the time Uruk's walls rose before them, immense and sunlit, Enkidu had become something neither fully wild nor fully urban, suspended between two worlds, carrying in his muscles the freedom of nature and in his mind the seeds of human reflection. Within the city, anticipation rippled quietly because rumors of the wild man preceded his arrival, and in the palace Gilgamesh sensed the shift in atmosphere, felt the tension gather like storm air, and for the first time in his life encountered a presence that did not shrink in his shadow. Their meeting was not diplomatic, it was collision. When Gilgamesh attempted to assert dominance, to exercise the privilege he had long claimed over his people, Enkidu stepped forward and blocked him, and what followed was a struggle so fierce that walls trembled and doorposts cracked, two forces of equal magnitude grappling not out of hatred but out of necessity, because identity forged without resistance demands resistance to mature. They wrestled through courtyards, their strength matched blow for blow, dust rising beneath their feet, the city watching breathless as their king met opposition not from foreign army or divine punishment but from embodied equality. And in that struggle something extraordinary occurred. Gilgamesh laughed, not mockery, recognition. For the first time his strength was mirrored. For the first time exertion required full commitment. For the first time he felt the exhilaration of limitation, the joy of resistance, the clarity that comes when ego meets equal force and survives. Eventually, Gilgamesh gained advantage and forced Enkidu down, but he did not destroy him, and Enkidu, rather than resent defeat, smiled because defeat had not diminished him but affirmed his place within a new hierarchy chosen rather than imposed. And in that instant, rivalry transformed into fraternity. What began as correction became companionship. The gods had not sent Enkidu to kill the king. They had sent him to humanize him. Because equality does what domination cannot, it reveals proportion. Standing beside Enkidu, Gilgamesh no longer towered unchallenged. He stood measured, contextualized, balanced, and in that balance emerged something softer yet stronger: friendship. Not the casual camaraderie of shared convenience, but the profound bond of two beings who recognize themselves reflected in each other's strengths and vulnerabilities, who see not threat but amplification, who understand that together they extend further than alone. For Gilgamesh, who had never known equal, the experience was transformative beyond language. For Enkidu, who had never known civilization, the city became meaningful through companionship rather than conquest. And thus the wild man sent by the gods fulfilled his purpose not by overthrowing the king, but by standing beside him, reshaping the trajectory of Uruk's ruler from unchecked dominance toward shared destiny. Yet equilibrium once established seeks expression, and two powerful friends within city walls soon felt the stirrings of restless ambition, because strength newly mirrored does not settle into stillness, it seeks proving ground. Gilgamesh, invigorated by companionship and intoxicated by the presence of one who could match him, turned his gaze outward, beyond Uruk's walls, toward challenges worthy of both their capacities. And in that outward turn lies the next escalation, the next movement in a story that has only begun to unfold. For now, though, what matters is this: the king who would not be equal had found his equal, and in that discovery the first crack appeared in his illusion of solitary greatness, replaced not with weakness but with connection, a bond that would soon propel them toward glory and toward cost. Something irreversible had taken place in the dust of Uruk's courtyards, something far more consequential than victory or defeat, because when two forces collide and neither shatters, what remains is not rivalry but recognition. And in that recognition Gilgamesh felt, perhaps for the first time in his life, the quiet relief of no longer standing alone at the summit of his own strength, no longer carrying the burden of singularity, no longer mistaking domination for identity. Enkidu did not bow as others bowed, and yet he did not challenge for the throne. Instead, he stood beside the king with an ease that neither diminished nor flattered, and this balance, subtle and powerful, began reshaping Gilgamesh from within, because companionship alters the internal landscape more profoundly than conquest ever can. And where once there had been restless assertion, there now emerged shared purpose. They spoke long into nights within the palace halls, voices echoing beneath torchlight as they exchanged stories of wilderness and city, of animals and temples, of instinct and ritual. And in these conversations Gilgamesh discovered a dimension of himself he had never accessed before: vulnerability not as weakness but as intimacy, the ability to articulate desire without proclamation, to confess fear without forfeiting authority. Enkidu in turn absorbed the rhythms of civilization through friendship rather than coercion, learning not only language and custom but ambition, because proximity to Gilgamesh meant exposure to a mind perpetually scanning horizons, a spirit incapable of settling into mere contentment, and gradually the two began to feed one another's hunger for magnitude. Strength seeks stage, power seeks proving ground, and soon Uruk's walls, once symbols of pride, began to feel like boundaries rather than achievements, because when two extraordinary beings sit side by side surveying a city already secured, their gaze inevitably shifts outward toward unknown territories where legacy might be carved deeper than brick. It was Gilgamesh who voiced the thought first, though Enkidu felt its tremor beneath the surface. Beyond the cultivated plains, beyond the rivers and trade routes, there stretched the cedar forest, ancient and immense, guarded by Humbaba, a monstrous being appointed by the god Enlil to protect sacred trees whose timber was prized yet feared, and no ordinary men dared enter that realm, because Humbaba's roar was said to be like floodwater, his breath fire, his presence suffocating. To most, the forest symbolized divine boundary. To Gilgamesh, it symbolized unfinished challenge. And in the presence of Enkidu, challenge no longer felt solitary. "Let us go," he said, and beneath the words lay more than ambition, because to conquer Humbaba would not merely expand Uruk's resources. It would immortalize their names, inscribe their strength into myth, transform companionship into legend, and Gilgamesh, whose walls already stood tall, sensed that true permanence required something beyond architecture. Enkidu hesitated, not from cowardice but from knowledge, because he had once roamed those wild edges and understood Humbaba's ferocity. Understood that this was no ceremonial opponent but a guardian of cosmic order, and yet friendship has gravity, and when Gilgamesh spoke of fame that outlives flesh, of deeds that echo beyond death, Enkidu felt the pull of shared destiny outweigh the caution of solitary survival. Here we glimpse the next layer of Gilgamesh's transformation. The king who once exerted force inward upon his people now directed force outward into myth, and this redirection, though noble in appearance, carried within it the seeds of consequence, because glory pursued beyond necessity always exacts price. Before departure, they sought blessing from Ninsun, Gilgamesh's divine mother, who perceived with maternal clarity both the magnitude of her son's ambition and the fragility of his mortality. And in ritual she adopted Enkidu symbolically as her own, binding the two not merely as companions but as brothers under divine witness. And in that act the bond deepened from camaraderie into kinship, sealing their journey in sacred context. The people of Uruk watched their king prepare for departure with mixed emotion, pride in his courage, anxiety for his safety, and perhaps a quiet recognition that the presence of Enkidu had softened something in him, made him more attentive, less tyrannical, as though friendship had redirected the intensity that once pressed down upon the city. As they set out toward the cedar forest, their path stretched long and symbolic, crossing cultivated land into wilderness, moving from order into primordial shadow, and along the way Gilgamesh's confidence surged and receded in waves, because even the boldest hearts feel tremor when approaching the unknown, and in those moments Enkidu's steadiness became anchor, reminding him of purpose, reinforcing the illusion that together they were invincible. Yet beneath invincibility lurked something subtler, the first whisper of mortality. For what is the pursuit of immortal fame if not subconscious acknowledgement that flesh decays? Gilgamesh spoke often of carving their names into time, of achieving deeds so great that future generations would speak them aloud, and though he did not yet articulate fear of death, his fixation on remembrance revealed awareness not fully formed but already stirring. Enkidu, listening, sensed this undercurrent but did not name it. Instead, he matched his friend's enthusiasm with loyalty, because shared ambition often obscures underlying anxiety. When at last they reached the threshold of the cedar forest, towering trees rising like pillars of ancient temple untouched by human axe, the air thick with resin and reverence, silence enveloped them with weight that pressed upon lungs and sharpened senses, and even Gilgamesh felt the gravity of crossing into sacred domain. Yet retreat was no longer possible without fracturing the identity he had begun to reshape. They stepped forward. And as they advanced deeper into shadow, the roar of Humbaba echoed through trunks older than memory, a sound not merely of anger but of warning, because guardians of divine boundary do not distinguish between ambition and trespass. And in that moment the brothers faced not only monster but moral line. Fear flickered across Gilgamesh's features, real, unmasked, and it was Enkidu who spoke courage into the space between them, reminding him that two together stand stronger than one alone, that doubt shared becomes bearable, that glory earned through risk binds deeper than safety preserved through caution. This reversal, this moment where the once wild man steadied the king, marked completion of the balance the gods had intended. For equality is not static but dynamic, shifting in strength and reassurance depending on circumstance. And in that exchange, their brotherhood solidified beyond rivalry into mutual reliance. Together they called upon Shamus, god of the sun, for aid, and winds rose to confound Humbaba, binding the monstrous guardian long enough for decisive strike. And as they lifted weapons and struck down the forest's protector, they crossed from challengers into transgressors, because killing Humbaba did not merely prove strength, it altered sacred equilibrium. As Humbaba fell, he pleaded, offering service in exchange for life, and here again Gilgamesh stood at threshold between mercy and legacy, between restraint and reputation, and though hesitation surfaced, ambition prevailed because to spare would dilute conquest, and to conquer required finality. The blow was struck, the guardian died, the cedar trees fell. And in the echoing silence that followed, triumph mixed with something heavier, something unnamed but present, as though victory carried shadow within it. They had achieved what none before dared. They had carved their names into myth, but in doing so they had awakened forces beyond simple rivalry. The forest, once inviolate, lay altered. The gods, once observers, now took notice. And Gilgamesh, standing beside Enkidu amidst fallen cedar, felt exhilaration so intense it nearly masked the tremor beneath. The realization that greatness gained through defiance always invites response. For now, however, celebration outweighed reflection, and the brothers prepared to return to Uruk not as mere companions but as heroes, unaware that glory achieved together would soon test them in ways strength alone could not withstand. They returned to Uruk with cedar logs dragged behind them like proof torn from the body of myth, their names already spreading through streets and marketplaces as mothers lifted children to glimpse the king and his companion who had entered sacred forest and emerged alive, who had struck down Humbaba and reshaped the boundary between mortal courage and divine prohibition. And for a time the city breathed pride so thick it seemed to rise with the dust beneath their feet, because victory, especially over what was once feared as untouchable, intoxicates not only the victors but the people who claim them as their own. Gilgamesh walked differently upon his return, not heavier, not humbled, but illuminated by affirmation, because to test oneself against the unknown and prevail reinforces the internal narrative of inevitability. And with Enkidu beside him, the story felt complete. Two heroes, equal in strength, bound by triumph, their bond tempered in danger and sealed in blood and resin beneath ancient trees. Yet triumph does not pass unnoticed in the heavens. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, whose presence shimmered between seduction and destruction, whose desire carried both ecstasy and ruin, watched the returning king from her temple heights, and what she saw stirred not simple attraction but fascination with magnitude, because Gilgamesh, radiant in victory and unapologetic in presence, embodied a force that mirrored her own intensity, and to beings of power, power itself is irresistible. She approached him not timidly but boldly, offering marriage, promising wealth, kingship beyond kingship, fertile lands and divine favor, and in her proposal lay not merely romance but elevation into a different realm of influence, an alliance that would bind mortal strength to divine fire. Yet Gilgamesh did not respond with gratitude or careful diplomacy. Instead, he laughed, not lightly, not playfully. He rejected her publicly, recounting the fates of her previous lovers: shepherds turned to wolves, stallions broken, warriors discarded, exposing her pattern of passion followed by devastation. And in doing so, he committed an act far more dangerous than refusal. He humiliated a goddess. There are refusals that preserve dignity, and there are refusals that provoke wrath. Gilgamesh chose the latter, perhaps because triumph had sharpened his boldness beyond prudence, perhaps because standing beside Enkidu emboldened him further, perhaps because the intoxicating echo of Humbaba's fall still reverberated within him, convincing him that no force, not forest guardian, not divine lover, required cautious appeasement. Ishtar's pride, ancient and volatile, ignited instantly, and she ascended to her father Anu, demanding retribution, her voice vibrating with fury, insisting that if the bull of heaven were not released upon Uruk, she would tear open the underworld and unleash chaos upon the living. And even the high gods hesitated, aware that unleashing such devastation risked balance itself. Yet divine anger is rarely moderated by reason once pride has been pierced. The bull of heaven descended, its hooves cracked earth, its breath scorched fields. With each step fissures split the ground, swallowing men into darkness, and panic rippled through Uruk as the sky seemed to tremble under the weight of celestial punishment, because what had been private insult now manifested as public catastrophe. Gilgamesh and Enkidu did not retreat. If anything, the arrival of divine challenge reawakened the fire that had carried them through the cedar forest, because shared danger reinforces shared identity, and where once Gilgamesh had sought proof of greatness alone, now he sought it alongside his brother, and together they confronted the bull not as subjects begging mercy, but as warriors refusing submission. The creature charged with force that shattered walls and tore through ranks, and Enkidu, drawing upon the wild strength that had once run beside gazelles, seized the bull by its tail, anchoring its momentum long enough for Gilgamesh to drive blade into flesh, and their coordination in battle reflected the intimacy forged in struggle, each movement anticipating the other, each risk absorbed collectively. The bull fell. Its massive body struck earth with thunderous finality. And for a second time the city erupted not in fear but in awe, because the impossible had happened again, not merely a guardian of forest slain, but a creature of heaven itself defeated by mortal hands. Victory rang louder than caution. Enkidu, flushed with triumph, tore the bull's thigh and hurled it toward Ishtar in defiance, an act raw with pride and reckless in its symbolism, because to kill divine emissary is transgression, to mock the deity who sent it is escalation beyond redemption. Gilgamesh stood beside him, neither apologized, neither bowed. And in that shared defiance they crossed another threshold, one less visible than forest boundary but more consequential, because while Humbaba guarded trees, the bull embodied divine retaliation, and to slay it was to assert that even heaven's wrath could be met with steel. The city celebrated through nightfall, feasting and singing beneath torchlight, unaware that the very excess of their joy deepened the severity of the response gathering above. For the gods do not ignore repeated defiance, especially when mortals begin to resemble rivals rather than supplicants. In the quiet beyond celebration, councils convened among the divine, and judgment formed not in fury alone but in recalibration of balance, because two men had stepped too far into realms reserved for cosmic hierarchy. And while Gilgamesh's lineage granted partial divinity, Enkidu's humanity made the equation uneven, and the gods decided that restoration required sacrifice. One would die, not both. 1. The choice fell upon Enkidu. When illness seized him, it did not resemble battlefield wound, but creeping, unraveling, strength draining not through blood but through invisible decree. And the wild man who had once sprinted beside antelope now lay restless upon bed within city walls, body burning, breath shallow, eyes clouded not by ignorance but by dawning realization. Gilgamesh, who had faced monsters without tremor, felt a different fear now, one without clear enemy, because there is no blade against divine sentence, no strategy against inevitability. And as Enkidu raved in fever, cursing the hunter who first found him, cursing Shamhat who drew him into civilization, longing briefly for the unbroken simplicity of wilderness, the weight of transformation pressed heavily upon both of them. In moments of lucidity, Enkidu wept not for himself but for unfinished companionship, for adventures untraveled, for laughter unshared, and Gilgamesh listened, helpless in a way he had never known, because strength that conquers external threat falters before internal decay. Here, at the edge of mortality, the meaning of their earlier victories shifted. What is killing Humbaba against losing a brother? What is slaying a celestial beast against watching breath fade? Enkidu's decline stretched days into nights of dread, and when at last silence replaced labored breathing, when the body that once wrestled kings lay still and unresponsive, Gilgamesh did not accept it immediately. He touched the flesh, waited for warmth, called his name repeatedly as though refusal might reverse decree. It did not, and in that stillness something far greater than friendship ended. Gilgamesh's illusion of invincibility shattered. The king who had rejected a goddess without fear now trembled before the simplest and most universal fact of existence. Death does not negotiate. He covered Enkidu's face. He tore his hair. He roamed the palace in grief unmasked, refusing burial for days as though proximity might deny permanence, because until this moment death had been abstraction, something that happened to others, to nameless soldiers swallowed by fishers, to guardians struck down in forest, but now it had entered his inner circle. And once death enters intimacy, it cannot be ignored. The bull of heaven had fallen, but heaven had responded. And the price of glory, long deferred, had arrived not as defeat in battle, but as absence in the heart. Grief does not descend upon a king differently than upon a shepherd. It does not moderate itself for power, nor soften its edge for those who once believed themselves protected by strength. And when Enkidu's body lay motionless within the palace of Uruk, the walls that Gilgamesh had once admired for their permanence seemed suddenly irrelevant, because no fortification, however immense, can keep death outside once it has entered through love. For days he refused burial, circling the body as though proximity might restore warmth, speaking to Enkidu as if his brother merely slept, commanding servants to wait, to delay, to deny the obvious, because acknowledgement would crystallize what he was not yet prepared to accept, that the force who had stood beside him in forest and battlefield, who had steadied his fear and matched his laughter, was gone in a way that no strength could reverse. When at last decay made denial impossible, when even the air itself insisted upon finality, Gilgamesh collapsed into lamentation so raw it echoed through Uruk like a second calamity, tearing at his hair, clawing at his skin, his voice cracking not with theatrical sorrow but with bewilderment, because grief is not merely sadness. It is disorientation, the sudden realization that the world you inhabited yesterday has been irreparably altered today. He ordered artisans to craft a statue in Enkidu's likeness, gold and lapis shaping memory into permanence, as though sculpted beauty might resist the erosion that flesh could not. and yet even as the statue rose gleaming within temple light, it did not breathe, it did not answer. It did not return the gaze of the king who now found himself once more alone at the summit. But this time the summit felt colder. Until Enkidu's death, mortality had been theoretical, an eventuality belonging to lesser men, distant and negotiable, but now it stood before Gilgamesh with unbearable clarity, and the question that had long hovered beneath ambition surged forward with relentless force. If Enkidu, strong as storm wind and fierce as lion, could fall, then what shield protects me? It is one thing to pursue glory for remembrance. It is another to realize remembrance is all that may remain. Fear, subtle and insidious, entered him not as cowardice but as awakening, and where once he had sought legacy through action, he now sought escape from the inevitable, and in that shift his journey turned inward even as his feet soon carried him outward. He abandoned royal garments, clothed himself in skins like a wanderer, and left Uruk without ceremony, because the city that once symbolized his mastery now felt like reminder of fragility, every brick whispering that walls endure while bodies decay, and he could not bear to remain surrounded by evidence of permanence that did not include him. Across plains and deserts he walked, unkempt and restless, eyes fixed not on conquest but on possibility of transcendence, and the people who glimpsed their king from afar scarcely recognized him, for grief had thinned his grandeur and stripped his posture of certainty, leaving a man propelled not by pride but by dread. His destination was not random. Deep within Mesopotamian lore there existed one human who had escaped death, Utnapishtim, survivor of the Great Flood, granted immortality by the gods, dwelling at the edge of the world beyond mortal reach, and to Gilgamesh this story, once mythic curiosity, now appeared as lifeline. If one man had crossed the boundary, perhaps another could. If immortality had been granted once, perhaps it could be earned, demanded, wrested from divine reluctance through persistence. Thus began not a quest for glory, but a quest against extinction. He crossed scorching lands where wind scoured skin and horizon shimmered with mirage, slept beneath open sky haunted by dreams of Enkidu's lifeless form, and in those dreams the body of his friend decayed visibly, returning to dust and worm, forcing upon him the image he most feared for himself, because grief transforms into projection, and projection becomes obsession. At the twin peaks of Mount Mashu, where scorpion beings guarded the gateway through which the sun passed nightly, he arrived diminished yet determined, and the guardians, whose gaze could kill lesser men, sensed both his divine fraction and his human desperation, questioning why a king approached the boundary reserved for celestial passage. He spoke not of conquest, not of pride, but of terror, confessing openly that he feared death as one fears darkness swallowing flame, and in that confession lies one of the most human moments in the epic, because the king who once laughed at a goddess now stood admitting vulnerability before monstrous sentinels, stripped of arrogance by loss. Moved by his resolve, or perhaps by recognition of his lineage, they permitted him passage through the tunnel of darkness where no sunlight pierced, a corridor stretching beyond perception, and for 12 double hours he walked in blackness so absolute it erased distinction between body and void, and symbolically this journey marked descent into the underworld of his own awareness, because to seek immortality one must confront the depth of mortality first. When at last light emerged and he reached the garden of jeweled trees by the cosmic sea, its fruits glittering with precious stone, beauty surreal and detached from human struggle, He continued onward to the shore where Sigeri, the tavern keeper of the gods, observed him from safety, wary of a man who looked more beast than king. She barred her door at first, perceiving danger in his disheveled appearance, but he spoke of Enkidu, of decay, of fear. And upon hearing his lament, she offered counsel not of transcendence, but of acceptance, urging him to return home, to eat, to dance, to cherish companionship and simple joy, because death is ordained and life is brief, and wisdom lies in savoring rather than fleeing. Her advice was gentle, practical, profound, and insufficient. For a man newly awakened to mortality does not immediately embrace moderation. He rejects it as surrender, and Gilgamesh, though respectful, pressed onward, because acceptance without struggle felt premature, as though he had not yet exhausted the possibility of exception. With Sigeri's guidance he sought Urshanabi, ferryman of the waters of death, whose boat alone could traverse the lethal sea separating mortals from Utnapishtim's dwelling, and through trial and negotiation he secured passage, cutting poles to propel vessel across waters that would claim life at mere touch. Each stroke across that sea deepened the symbolism of his journey, because he was no longer battling beasts or divine emissaries. He was rowing against inevitability itself, driven by the question that now defined him: must I too die? At last he reached Utnapishtim, ancient and weathered, yet alive beyond natural span, and when the immortal regarded the king before him, he did not see rival but mirror of past desperation, for once he too had been mortal, once he too had faced annihilation in flood, and immortality had not been prize won but accident granted. Gilgamesh demanded the secret, not gently, not humbly. He pleaded and argued, recounting his deeds, invoking his lineage, citing his loss, but Utnapishtim responded with sober clarity. Immortality is not conquest, it is exception, and even I hold it not as triumph, but as burden granted once and not repeated. Yet Gilgamesh persisted, and in response Utnapishtim proposed a simple test: stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, for if he could conquer sleep, perhaps he might claim endurance beyond ordinary men. Sleep, that gentle cousin of death, arrived swiftly. Exhausted by grief and travel, Gilgamesh succumbed almost instantly, and as he lay unconscious, Utnapishtim instructed his wife to bake a loaf of bread each day beside him, marking passage of time, and when at last he awoke, believing only moments had passed, 7 hardened loaves testified to his failure. He who slew Humbaba, he who struck down the bull of heaven, could not conquer sleep. And in that quiet revelation lay devastating truth. Mortality is woven into human design not through weakness of arm, but through structure of existence. He was not exempt, he was not exception. The price of glory was not merely Enkidu's death, but awakening to his own impermanence. Failure before Utnapishtim did not humiliate Gilgamesh in the way public defeat once might have, because humiliation belongs to pride wounded before others, and here there were no cheering crowds nor rival kings to witness his collapse into sleep, only the quiet presence of an immortal who regarded him not with contempt but with weary understanding. And yet the realization that he could not resist even the simplest boundary of human limitation settled upon him like a weight heavier than any monster he had faced. For the first time since Enkidu's death, anger did not surge forward to mask vulnerability. Instead, something deeper and colder took root: comprehension that the structure of his being included expiration, that the divine fraction within him did not annul the mortal portion, and that strength, no matter how immense, cannot bend the architecture of time. Utnapishtim, perhaps moved by the king's raw persistence or by memory of his own former humanity, offered not immortality but consolation in the form of knowledge, revealing that deep beneath the waters lay a plant whose thorns pierced like roes and whose essence could restore youth to an old man, a living reminder that renewal exists even within decay, though not permanence, and Gilgamesh seized upon this revelation not as philosophical lesson but as tangible hope. If he could not abolish death entirely, perhaps he could delay it, renew himself, extend vitality beyond natural decline, and in this compromise we see the human instinct recalibrating from absolute defiance to negotiated postponement, because when immortality proves unreachable, longevity becomes second prize. He bound stones to his feet and plunged into the deep, descending through cold darkness where pressure tightened around ribs and light vanished into muted blur, and in that descent there was something almost symbolic of acceptance. He did not command the waters, he entered them. He did not demand from the gods, he searched beneath them. And when his hands closed around the thorned plant and he severed it from its rooted bed, triumph flickered once more, smaller than before yet luminous enough to propel him upward. Emerging from the depths with the plant secured, he felt something resembling restoration of purpose, not because he believed himself invincible again, but because he possessed an object that bridged despair and possibility, and he resolved not to consume it immediately but to carry it back to Uruk, to test its power upon an elder first, to share its benefit rather than hoard it selfishly, and in that intention we glimpse subtle maturation. The king who once asserted dominance, now imagining distribution. The journey home began not with frantic urgency but measured steps, because hope slows panic, and for the first time since Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh's thoughts turned toward return rather than escape, toward the city he had abandoned in grief, toward walls that now symbolized not imprisonment but continuity. Yet transformation is rarely linear, and lessons learned in extremity often require reinforcement. And as he paused beside a cool spring to bathe, setting the plant upon ground while water washed dust from his skin, the natural world reminded him of its quiet persistence, for from beneath stones a serpent emerged, drawn by scent of vitality, and before Gilgamesh could react, it consumed the plant and slithered away, shedding its skin as it vanished, leaving behind only the faint impression of renewal transferred elsewhere. He stood motionless, not in rage, not in denial, but in hollow recognition. The plant was gone. Hope of renewal swallowed not by divine punishment, but by ordinary creature following instinct, and the symbolism struck deeper than loss of object. Rejuvenation would belong to cycles of nature, to serpents shedding skin, not to kings grasping permanence. For a moment despair threatened to reopen the wound Enkidu's death had carved, yet something within him had shifted during his journey, and rather than collapse entirely, he sat beside the spring and wept not with wild protest but with tired clarity, because grief repeated does not feel identical, it matures. He had traveled beyond mountains and darkness, crossed waters forbidden to mortal men, stood before the only human granted immortality, failed to conquer sleep, retrieved a plant from the deep and lost it to serpent's hunger, and through each stage the same truth had crystallized. Death cannot be evaded by strength, nor bargained with through endurance, nor outwitted through possession. The road back to Uruk stretched long, Yet this time his pace carried not frantic urgency but contemplation. And as he approached the city's towering walls, the same walls he once surveyed with pride untempered by awareness, he saw them differently, no longer as monuments to defy mortality, but as testament that human hands can shape continuity even if human bodies cannot persist. He turned to Urshanabi and gestured toward the fortifications, inviting him to consider the brickwork, the foundations laid deep, the craftsmanship that would endure beyond individual lifespans, and in that gesture there was no boast, only acknowledgement that while immortality of flesh remains unreachable, immortality of creation lies within reach of disciplined effort. This is not resignation, it is recalibration. Gilgamesh did not abandon ambition, he redirected it, shifting from pursuit of endless life to pursuit of meaningful legacy, from obsession with avoiding death to investment in shaping what survives it. When he entered Uruk again, the people saw not the tyrant of old nor the reckless conqueror of forest and heaven, but a king altered by encounter with limit, eyes quieter, posture grounded not in dominance but in comprehension, and though grief for Enkidu remained woven into him, it no longer consumed his horizon entirely. He ordered the inscription of his deeds, ensuring that story itself would carry memory beyond his years, because narrative preserves what flesh cannot, and in recording both triumph and failure he demonstrated acceptance of complexity, of human arc that includes both ascent and collapse. The fear that once drove him across deserts did not vanish completely. Mortality remains unsettling even when acknowledged, but it ceased to dominate his decisions, and in its place emerged something steadier: stewardship. He governed with greater restraint, no longer compelled to prove uniqueness through constant challenge, because equality had already reshaped him and mortality had already humbled him, and within those twin lessons lay maturation more profound than any battle could offer. Enkidu's absence did not fade, it integrated, becoming quiet companion in memory rather than open wound, and perhaps in moments upon the city walls Gilgamesh felt both sorrow and gratitude, understanding that without friendship he might never have confronted death honestly, and without death he might never have discovered the limits that grant life its intensity. The king who once would not be equal had been made equal by loss. The warrior who sought to carve immortality through conquest had learned to carve meaning through creation. And the man who feared death above all had returned not immortal, but wise. When Gilgamesh stepped once more beneath the shadow of Uruk's towering walls, he did not do so as a conqueror returning with trophies, nor as a broken wanderer clutching illusions, but as something more complex and far rarer. A king who had looked directly into the abyss of his own impermanence and come back not with escape, but with understanding, and that distinction, though invisible to the crowds who gathered to see him, altered the internal architecture of his rule more profoundly than any victory over monster or god. The gates opened as they always had, the brickwork still firm, the foundations still anchored in earth shaped by countless laborers, and for a long moment he paused before entering, letting his hand rest against the wall's sun-warmed surface, feeling not the cold permanence he once envied but the patient endurance of collective effort, because these stones were not immortal in themselves. They would one day crumble, yet they would outlast him, and in that realization there was no jealousy now, only alignment. Inside the city, life had continued during his absence, markets had traded, children had grown, Rituals had unfolded beneath temple roofs, and this continuity, once taken for granted, now appeared to him as quiet miracle because while individual lives flicker and vanish, the pattern of existence persists, and to serve that pattern became his new orientation. He called for scribes, he summoned artisans. He instructed them to inscribe upon tablets the full account of his journey, not merely the triumph over Humbaba, not merely the slaying of the bull of heaven, but the grief for Enkidu, the descent into despair, the failure before Utnapishtim, the loss of the plant to the serpent, because to omit vulnerability would be to preserve illusion, and illusion no longer interested him. This choice is crucial. The earlier Gilgamesh might have curated legend carefully, preserving only grandeur and minimizing frailty, but the man who returned understood that story gains power not through perfection but through truth, and by embedding his fear within narrative, he ensured that future generations would encounter not an untouchable demigod, but a reflection of themselves amplified. He walked the city often, not in restless search of challenge, but in contemplative survey, noticing details once beneath his attention, the careful weaving of textiles, the rhythm of bakers shaping dough, the deliberate carving of temple reliefs, and in these observations he found something subtler than glory: participation. For to build a city that endures requires not singular domination but sustained coordination, and though his strength remained formidable, he no longer sought to measure it against every man. Instead, he measured himself against the responsibility of stewardship. The memory of Enkidu did not fade into abstraction. It accompanied him like echo, reminding him that companionship transforms identity and that loss clarifies value. And in honoring that memory, he softened practices that once burdened his people, relinquishing customs rooted in entitlement and replacing them with policies rooted in balance, because the king who had once consumed his city's energy now sought to sustain it. Time passed not in frantic pursuit of conquest, but in deliberate shaping of governance, and though legends of his earlier feats continued to circulate, they no longer defined him exclusively. Instead, he became known as the ruler who had traveled beyond the edge of the world and returned wiser, whose eyes carried both fire and shadow. Yet even wisdom does not erase mortality, it merely contextualizes it. Gilgamesh aged. Not dramatically, not in immediate collapse, but gradually, as joints stiffened and hair threaded with silver, as strength remained impressive yet no longer infinite, and each subtle change affirmed the lesson he had resisted so fiercely, that life is arc, not plateau. He did not seek the serpent to reclaim the plant. He did not attempt to reopen the sea. He did not march again toward Utnapishtim. Acceptance had replaced defiance, and in acceptance there was dignity more enduring than conquest. Sometimes at dusk he would ascend the walls, gaze outward across plains flushed with fading light, and consider how those who followed him would one day walk the same stones, unaware of the weight of his early arrogance or the depth of his later fear. And he found comfort in that anonymity, because immortality through memory need not preserve ego, it need only preserve narrative. He understood now that story itself is vessel against oblivion. The tablets inscribed with his journey became his true monument, not because they promised endless life, but because they transmitted understanding. That strength without balance breeds suffering, that companionship refines power, that glory pursued recklessly invites consequence, that death humbles even kings, and that acceptance restores proportion. In this way, he achieved a form of immortality not through endless breath, but through shared insight. Future generations would read of Humbaba and the bull, of Enkidu's creation and demise, of the flood and the plant. And within those accounts they would locate their own anxieties mirrored, their own questions about mortality and meaning echoed across centuries, and thus Gilgamesh's life extended beyond its biological span into collective consciousness. The king who once feared death above all came to see it not as enemy but as boundary that renders action urgent, and urgency, when guided by wisdom, becomes catalyst for contribution rather than destruction. He died eventually, as all men do. Not amid divine thunder nor in catastrophic downfall, but within the natural rhythm he had come to accept, his body returning to earth from which both he and Enkidu had once been shaped, and the city did not crumble in his absence because he had learned to anchor it in structure rather than in self. Uruk endured, its walls stood for generations. Its story traveled beyond river valleys into distant lands, carried by merchants and scribes, translated across tongues, reshaped yet recognizable, and within those retellings Gilgamesh lived again and again, not as tyrant nor solely as hero, but as archetype, the first great figure to confront mortality consciously and narrate the confrontation. If we trace the arc from the king who would not be equal to the ruler who embraced equality with all living beings in death, we see not collapse but evolution, not defeat but integration, because maturity in its highest form does not annihilate ambition, it tempers it. The journey beyond the edge of the world was not failure, it was initiation, and the return to Uruk was not retreat, it was culmination. The earliest epic humanity preserved chose not to glorify endless conquest, but to meditate on limitation, on grief, on acceptance. And in doing so it revealed that even at the dawn of recorded story, our ancestors understood the central tension that still defines us. We build walls knowing they will fall, we love knowing we will lose, we strive knowing we will. And in striving anyway, in loving anyway, in building anyway, we carve meaning from impermanence. Gilgamesh did not conquer death. He encountered it, wrestled it, fled from it, sought to bargain with it, failed against it, and finally bowed not in defeat but in recognition. That recognition is his true victory. And so we arrive at something quieter than battle and deeper than grief. Something that lingers not in the clang of weapons nor in the roar of celestial beasts, but in the patient endurance of clay tablets pressed with cuneiform signs, because the final transformation of Gilgamesh was not from king to wanderer nor from tyrant to steward, but from man to story, and story, unlike flesh, travels across millennia without aging. Long after his body returned to the earth from which it had once been shaped, long after Uruk's walls weathered and were rebuilt, long after the names of lesser rulers dissolved into dust, the narrative of his life remained etched into memory, copied by scribes, translated across dialects, carried through shifting empires, surviving conquest and flood and fire, because the themes embedded within it, friendship, ambition, loss, mortality, are not confined to a single culture, but woven into the human condition itself. It is astonishing to consider that among the earliest preserved literature of our species stands not a simple hymn of praise nor a dry account of agricultural yield, but an exploration of existential anxiety, a king who dares to ask what it means to die and what it means to endure, suggesting that from the dawn of civilization humanity has been preoccupied not only with survival but with significance. Gilgamesh's story predates the Iliad, predates the Hebrew scriptures in written form, predates philosophical treatises by millennia, and yet its psychological terrain feels startlingly familiar, because the fear that drove him across deserts is the same fear that flickers within modern hearts, the same dread of disappearance, the same longing to matter beyond the span of breath. In that sense, Gilgamesh becomes less a distant Mesopotamian ruler and more a mirror held up to every era, reflecting the tension between ambition and acceptance, between striving for greatness and reconciling with finitude. His early tyranny embodies the raw ego of unchecked power, the illusion that strength justifies dominance. His friendship with Enkidu reveals the transformative force of equality. His defiance against Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven dramatizes humanity's audacity in challenging divine or natural limits. His grief exposes vulnerability beneath heroism. His quest for immortality articulates the universal refusal to vanish quietly. And his eventual return to Uruk demonstrates the maturation that arises not from defeating death, but from integrating its inevitability. The epic does not conclude with triumphant conquest of eternity. It concludes with perspective. Gilgamesh points to the walls of Uruk and invites admiration not of himself, but of craftsmanship, of collective effort, of structures that endure beyond individual lifespans, subtly redirecting focus from singular ego to communal continuity. In doing so, the first great hero narrative resists the temptation to glorify endless dominion and instead honors the quieter heroism of acceptance. Consider the arc once more. A king who could not tolerate equal becomes a man who embraces equality with all living beings in mortality. A ruler obsessed with carving his name into time learns that time itself cannot be carved, only joined. A warrior who believed himself partly divine learns that the mortal fraction defines him more profoundly than the divine. And perhaps that is why his story survived, because it does not flatter human exceptionalism unconditionally, it tempers it. It acknowledges that we are capable of astonishing feats, of building cities from mud, of composing poetry in wedge-shaped script, of confronting gods in imagination. Yet it also insists that none of these abolish the fundamental boundary of death. In a world where many myths celebrate apotheosis, where heroes ascend to constellations or dwell eternally in paradise, the Epic of Gilgamesh stands apart in its sobriety, granting its protagonist wisdom instead of escape, maturity instead of transcendence. That choice feels deliberate, almost instructional. It suggests that our ancestors, even at civilization's dawn, recognized that the deeper victory lies not in conquering mortality, but in living fully within its frame. And so when modern readers encounter the image of Gilgamesh standing upon Uruk's walls, gesturing outward, inviting others to behold the city's strength, we witness not boast but testament that human effort, though temporary in individual form, accumulates into shared heritage, that culture itself becomes vessel for continuity. The serpent that consumed the plant of youth did not defeat him entirely. It merely redirected renewal into natural cycles, reminding him that immortality exists not as static possession, but as perpetual transformation, as shedding of skin generation after generation. His legacy, then, is not eternal youth. It is narrative longevity. Every time his name is spoken, every time his story is retold, the ancient clay breathes again, and in that repetition he achieves what he once sought in desperation, endurance beyond death. But it is endurance reframed, not endless heartbeat, endless echo. And echoes do not belong to one throat, they reverberate through many. Thus Gilgamesh becomes archetype, not anomaly, the first recorded hero whose journey maps the interior landscape of humanity, whose fears anticipate our own, whose acceptance models what remains possible when denial fails. In him we see the evolution from arrogance to awareness, from domination to stewardship, from panic to peace. His epic reminds us that even the earliest civilizations grappled with the same questions that animate philosophy and literature today. What is the measure of a life? What endures when flesh fades? How do we respond to loss? How do we face the certainty of death without surrendering vitality? The answers offered are not simplistic, nor are they triumphant in the conventional sense. They are steady: build, love, create, remember, accept. In this way, the first story ever told becomes perpetual companion to all stories that follow, shaping narrative tradition itself, influencing later myths of flood and heroism, whispering beneath epics of Greece and scriptures of Israel, echoing across centuries as humanity refines but never resolves the tension between mortality and meaning. And perhaps that is the quiet marvel, that at the very beginning of recorded literature, humanity chose not to immortalize invulnerability, but to immortalize the struggle against inevitability and the wisdom found in surrendering to it with dignity. Gilgamesh began as king who would not be equal. He ended as man who understood equality with all. Between those poles lies the entire arc of human maturation. His walls may have crumbled, his bones may have dissolved. But the story carved in clay endures, and through it the ancient king continues to walk beside us, not as conqueror of death, but as companion in facing it.